At the general rules of your clocking schedule, you can select to enable or disable employees defining the status of their clocking on the fingertip terminal. Click on Edit, select this option to Yes to have your users selecting the clocking status such as clock in, clock out, overtime, or else on the machine while performing the attendance. Following the status they have selected on the machine, the attendance sheet will enter the clocking data inside each column accordingly. Next is the rounding rules of your clocking schedule. Round up the work time to nearest minutes. For an example, if you set this option to 30 minutes, for the total work hour that has been done within a day, you can select the rounding such as round up. It means that if anyone worked between 7 hours and a half, where the expected time of work was 8 hours, to 8 hours, the total work hour will be automatically rounded to 8 hours. It means that if I today worked for 7 hours and 45 minutes, by setting this rule inside the clocking schedule, in my attendance sheet, today work hour will be calculated as 8 hours. Or the other way around, if you set this option to down and I have worked 7 hours and 45 minutes for 30 minutes, my total work hour inside the system will be calculated only as 7 hours and a half and not 7 hours and 45 minutes. This is the exact same rule applicable for overtime calculation. It means that if instead of 2 hours of overtime I have done 1 hour and 45 minutes, automatically the system will round my overtime hours to 2 hours. If you set this option to down, the system will round my overtime hours to only 1 hour and 30 minutes. If you don't have any of these options, you can just leave them blank. The next rounding rule inside the weekly clocking schedule of Ingress software is first rounding time range. Meaning that if you set the time for the rounding time range between 8:30 and 9:30 to 9, it means that if any clocking that has been done within this range between 8:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m., the clocking inside the attendance sheet will be rounded to 9 a.m. The first rounding time range is for the in time of the clocking that has been set inside the clocking time. However, the last rounding range is for the out time or the last clock out of the clocking schedule inside the attendance sheet. Hence, if you set this time for 15:30 to 18:30 to be rounded to 18 minutes, meaning that the clockings for the out time that has been done between 5:30 to 6:30 will be rounded back to 6 o'clock and displayed inside the attendance sheet. Now these are the break rules of your weekly clocking schedule inside the Ingress software. Starting with the first one, do not deduct any lunch time if the employee works half day only. It means that if your employee comes to work at 9 a.m. and instead of working the whole day, she or he leaves the work at 1 p.m., you do not want any break time to be deducted from the employee. So you need to select this option. The next two rules, do you want to apply auto add break rule when you include lunch or dinner time, and do you want to include lunch or dinner time into overtime, means that if for selecting the first time, the remaining time of the break that a user is allowed to take will be added to his work hour. Let's say if a user is allowed to take 1 hour of break and instead of 1 hour of break he takes 30 minutes of break, the remaining 30 minutes will be added to his total work hour time. However, by selecting this option, the remaining 30 minutes will be added to his working hours as overtime hour. The next option is, do you want to deduct extra lunch or dinner time from working hour? By selecting this option, you will restrict the users to take only the allowed period for the break time. It means that if a user takes more than the allowed period of break or takes extended break, the total minutes that has been taken will be deducted from the total work hours. The next option is deduct the number of hours for break time from overtime hour, meaning that if you set the time here for 1 hour and the overtime period for 3 hours, it means that if a user takes 3 hours of overtime, 1 hour of break will be deducted from his total overtime hour. Once again, if any of these rules are not applicable to your clocking schedule, you can just leave them blank, save and move on to the next option. At the overtime tab of the weekly clocking schedule, you can select the overtime rules applicable to your clocking schedule. Starting with the first one, early time for work before in time. It means that if you grant overtime for coming to work earlier than the set in time, you can select this option. For an example, if I set the in time at 9 a.m. and instead of 9 a.m. a user comes to work at 7 a.m., he will be granted to take 2 hours of OT before his normal working hour starts by selecting this option. Overtime differential rate interval. By defining a differential rate interval for overtime, you will allow users to take overtime with a differential rate. It means that for any of the time of the day that you define in this column, the users perform overtime, this overtime period will be calculated as a different column inside the attendance sheet. For example, if an employee works, in this case, between 1:30 a.m. to 2:30 a.m., he will be granted for 1 hour of differential OT inside the clocking attendance sheet. Minimum minutes must work to qualify for overtime. This means that a user has to fulfill a certain minimum minutes of overtime hour to be able to be granted for overtime. Let's say if I set this option to 60 minutes, any of the users who are following this clocking schedule will only be rewarded for overtime if they perform at least 60 minutes of overtime. And the next option is the maximum number of hours allowed to claim OT. This is for the employees to define the limited time of overtime that can be allowed to be taken within 1 day. Let's say that if I set this time to 4 hours, my users in the company are only allowed to take 4 hours of overtime. Any time more than 4 hours of overtime will no longer be calculated inside the attendance sheet. The next rule is the deduct short time from overtime, considered as the compensation rule. If one comes to work late, stay late to cover for the late in time. The next one is the work tree as overtime, meaning that by selecting any of these options in any of these working days, rest day, off day or holiday, the work hour that has been calculated in rest day, off day or holiday will be considered or calculated as overtime. Exclude short time if any. It means that following the clocking time that you have set inside the clocking time of your clocking schedule, if there is any short time within these days, it will not be calculated or it will be excluded. That's all for the rules of your clocking schedule inside the weekly clocking schedule.